Okay, a couple of quick points. Remember that for Friday, you're doing response paper 8, right? We're almost at the end of these guys, you know, only 2 more to do after this. There's only about a month left in the semester. So we are getting close to the end of the tunnel here. And remember to complete the vocab quiz for Sunday. Now for Monday, we're going to have a slightly unusual situation. This is the only time you're going to need to bring 2 different books to class with you, right? Because the Irish Revival background stuff, the Proclamation of the Irish Republic, and the Matthew Arnold piece on Celtic literature are in Volume E. But the Yeats poems that you're reading alongside of them are in Volume F. So make sure that you bring both the Victorian volume you have been bringing to class and the green 20th century volume with you as well. And then everything we're going to be doing after Monday is going to be in this book. So this will then be the only one you'll need to bring to class from Wednesday onward. So does anybody have any questions about anything? Now that you've had a little bit of time to sit with the group presentation assignment, does anybody have any questions about that? Yeah, Jamal.
Do our sources need to be purely literary?
What do you mean purely literary?
Like books and such, or can we use like an article or?
Yeah, you can use journal articles that you get from the library. Don't use things from the popular press or things that you get off of the internet, just like on your own. I'll explain why in a minute. Yeah, Hannah.
For our topic, can we use pieces that we've read in class?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I'm hoping people will incorporate stuff we've already done in class and like connect it to themes we've already been talking about and the texts that we've already talked about.
What about an interview?
Pardon?
What about an interview?
If
we were to use like an autobiography and use an interview with the author.
Okay, yeah, that's something like that would be fine. The thing I just don't want people doing is just like going and Googling shit and using that as research, right? So yeah, something like an interview with one of the authors you're talking about, that's totally fine. That's absolutely cool. But yeah, in general, yeah, if you have questions about a specific source and whether or not it's valid for the assignment, just show me the source. I'll look it over and tell you whether it's any good or not. Any other questions about the presentations? So this afternoon, I'm going to email you guys the assignment sheet for paper 2, which will be, the paper itself will be due in the final, like during finals week, to give you plenty of time to do it. But we're going to do it in stages as well, right? Remember how we did a proposal for paper 1 first, and I commented on that, and then you did the paper. We're going to do something similar with paper 2. You're going to do a proposal for that, but you're also going to do an annotated bibliography as part of this, right? So you're doing, to make sure that you do the research in advance of, you know, having to write the paper. So I will give you the due dates for all of that and the assignment sheet for all of that over email this afternoon. One thing to note about this, right? This is going to be a research paper. It's going to be roughly, so like 7 to 9 pages, and you're going to be talking about 2 texts, right? You're going to take one text from before midterm and one text from after midterm, and you're going to compare the way they deal with a similar theme. Couple of stipulations. This will all be on the assignment sheet, but just so everybody knows, what's going on going in, right? You can build on response papers that you've written, right? You can use those as a basis. You cannot use the same text you wrote paper 1 about, and you can't use the text you're doing your presentation on. Otherwise, you can use any text that you want that are talking about a similar theme. So does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, great. Then let's start today by reviewing a little bit of what we talked about last time. Then I want to use the great social evil, which we didn't really get to discuss, as a kind of segue into Goblin Market, because I think it is. Goblin Market and this great social evil newspaper article are actually doing very similar things, even if it doesn't look like it on the surface. So what do we remember from last time about middle class values and the notion of respectability? What did it mean to a middle class Victorian to be respectable?
Conform.
Okay, yeah, conformist, yeah.
Be predictable.
Okay, be predictable. Right? Don't be eccentric.
So it's based on the image of the royal family,
Yeah,
of Victoria and Albert.
sure. Be like Vicky and Al.
Who?
Victoria and Albert. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert.
Oh.
So how does this then take different paths for men and for women? We didn't talk as much about men, right? But for a man to be respectable, right, he was to be discreet in his business and personal lives. Right, which means in his business life, right, to be free of debt. Debt was shameful and obvious criminality. Because remember, this is all about other people's perception of you, right? You want people to perceive you as honest and forthright, even if you're not. Now, in terms of personal lives, right, what this means is not so much that men were not to be out, having extramarital affairs or consorting with prostitutes, but that they were not to do so openly and obviously, right? You were supposed to maintain the appearance of chastity, particularly if you were married. Now, for women, this meant keeping a beautiful and pleasant home, right? A kind of sanctuary for the man to come back to after he's been out sullying himself in the world of business all day, right? And women were expected in particular to behave selflessly, right? Remember Sarah Stickney Ellis's notion of disinterested kindness. Do we remember what this meant, what disinterested kindness was? From that Victorian conduct manual by Sarah Stickney Ellis?
Oh, it's when you be kind and you don't have any gain from it.
Yes, be kind to people when you have nothing to gain from it, right? This is a virtue that women in particular were expected to practice. Now, the other virtue that was particularly expected of middle-class women was chastity. Both inside and outside of marriage. So, if you were a married woman, you are absolutely not to be having sex with anyone other than your husband. even if he is out getting some on the side. If you are a single woman, then you are not to be having sex with anyone at all. Right? You are to be preserving that chastity for your future husband, right? We still see some of these attitudes in, say, like contemporary evangelical Christianity, right? You know, these kinds of attitudes toward. Although I think that it's a little bit more even-handed. That men are expected to abide by several of the same rules. But in the Victorian middle class case, there's a definite double standard, right? Women are expected to abide by rules that men aren't. Men are fine as long as they maintain the appearance of propriety. Women are expected to go the whole hog, right? So what this leads to is a kind of dual idea of the middle class woman, right? There are kind of two poles, two standards by which she's judged, right? The first, we talked about last time, is referred to as the angel in the house. And the angel in the house image looks something like this. Not this blank screen, but what's going to be on it in a second. So while we're waiting for this to come up, what do we remember from discussion last time about the angel in the house?
Women wanting to be desired.
Okay. And how did a woman make herself desirable to a man? What behaviors were connected with this? What was she expected to be or to do?
Like, embroider and play piano and stuff like that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Like embroider and play piano, stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, the superficial stuff was that she was supposed to have these particular accomplishments, right? Not education, but accomplishments. She's supposed to be able to embroider prettily and to play the piano or the harp, maybe to sing a little, right? But certainly not to compose music. The basic element of angel in the houseness, though, is this notion of disinterested kindness, of selflessness, right? Of total subordination of the self to the needs of the husband in the home, right? So, here we have our, Victorian man of the world, coming home, taking the baby from his wife's arms, pretty wife comes to greet him, her hair is fully done up, she's wearing her long flouncy dress, she's not just sitting around in an old house coat. The children are all dressed and washed and gathered around her skirts. The little boy is playing with a dog. Right, so the basic notion of angel in the houseness is that you were supposed to, for your husband, in order to make him morally better, right, in order to improve him, provide examples of goodness, kindness, and innocence, right? And to do so selflessly, to constantly sacrifice yourself for his sake. Now, the opposite pole of this is referred to as the fallen woman. And this painting's a little dark, so I'm going to turn off the light so you can see it a little better. So what do we see happening in this painting? What does the image show us? Can we tell what's going on here?
Looks like someone being figured out.
Yeah. We have a young woman here. What's she holding? Can you tell?
A baby?
Yep, she's holding the baby.
Is she pregnant?
Well, not anymore.
I don't know if I'm wrong, but it looks like she's pregnant.
She is probably just recently delivered. So yeah, pardon?
Like, if he gave her out because she was with another man besides him.
Well, this is not her husband. It's like he's significantly older, right? This is her father. So what we have here is a young woman who has had a baby out of wedlock, being kicked out of the house, right? For shaming the family. We have, the father pointing the way to the door, right? The mother kind of looking sad and ineffective back here. One of her younger sisters is pleading with the father to be merciful, right? But the father, not wanting this stain on the family honor, kicks the girl out into the street, right? And this is the basic archetype here of the fallen woman, right? The fallen woman is a middle-class woman who has committed a sexual impropriety. Right, in this case, this young woman has had a child but is not married, right? And the fallen woman is generally shunned by respectable society, right? The usual narrative of the fallen woman, and this is where we segue into the great social evil, the usual narrative of the fallen woman is that she sinks into a life of prostitution and dissipation, right? Drunkenness, drug abuse, whatever, right? That this sexual impropriety gets her kicked out of respectable society and she can never find her way back in because of this, right? No one is to allow her back in. Now, one thing I should note is that the extent to which either of these archetypes existed in real life is questionable, right? Real life is messier and more complicated typically than art and culture. So there probably weren't angels in the house and fallen women fluttering all over Victorian England, right? But these were the two standards by which feminine behavior was judged. So even if these figures didn't exist in real life, they had a powerful cultural pull, right? They had a real purchase on the Victorian imagination. Now, I want to go to page 666 in the Victorian volume, to the Great Social Evil. First, to look at the introduction here and what this particular letter was responding to, right? The writer of this letter was responding to a previous letter in the Times of London that had been signed by a woman who called herself One More Unfortunate. And that woman's narrative had been the conventional fallen woman narrative, right? That she was asking for pity from the public as Parliament was contemplating a round of anti-prostitution legislation. She claimed to have been a governess for children from a respectable family who was seduced and abandoned by a man. And as such, she lost her job, her family shunned her, and she had no recourse but to go out onto the streets as a prostitute. Now, what the writer of this letter is suggesting is that people like One More Unfortunate didn't actually exist, right? That prostitution wasn't something that people from the middle classes fell into. It was something that people from the lower and working classes rose into. So if we look, can I get somebody to read the paragraph here at the bottom of page 666, where she says, "I was a very pretty child and had a sweet voice."
I was a very pretty child and had a sweet voice.
Of course, I used to sing. Most London boys and girls of the lower classes sing. My face is my fortune. Kind sir, she said, was the ditty on which I bestowed most pains, and my father, who and my mother would wink knowingly as I sang it. The latter would also tell me how pretty she was when young, and how she sang, and what a fool she had been, and how well she might have done had she been wise.
Okay, thank you. Can somebody read the next paragraph for us? Frequently we had a stir in our colony.
Frequently we had quite a stir in our colony. Some young lady who had quitted the paternal restraint, or perhaps been started off. None knew whether or how to seek her fortune would reappear among us with a profusion of ribbons, fine clothes, and lots of cash. Visiting the neighbors, treating indiscriminately was the order of the day on such occasions. Without any more definite information of the means by which the dazzling transformation had been effected, they could be conveyed by knowing winks and the words luck and friends. Then she would disappear and leave us in our
It's okay. Dirt.
leave us in our dirt and penury and obscurity. You cannot conceive, sir, how our young ambition was stirred by these violations.
Okay, so this visitor to the neighborhood, what is she? What does she do for a living? It doesn't state explicitly, right, but it gives us hints. This woman in the fine clothes and ribbons handing out cash.
Is she a philanthropist?
She's not a no, she's not a philanthropist. In fact, the philanthropist would be the one trying to stamp out this sort of thing, right? The ones marching on the halls of Parliament, with signs that say down with this sort of thing. Why are people so reluctant to say how this particular woman has been transformed? Except by, knowing winks and nods and nudges and references to luck and friends. What is she? She's a prostitute. So what this girl is telling us, right, is that the only rich people she ever saw growing up, right, the only people with nice clothes and lots of money who could, show up and, treat everybody to dinner and drinks, right? The only people she knew who had this stuff were prostitutes. When her parents are giving each other knowing winks and her mother is saying how pretty she was when young and what a fool she'd been, right? What did her mother do that was foolish? Married her father, right? The mother is suggesting that she would have done better had she gone this route, right? The whole point here being, right, when you live in dirt and penury and squalor, and the only people you ever see who have money are prostitutes, that doesn't look like falling at all, right? That looks like moving up. And so what this letter writer is trying to do is offer to the middle-class readers of the Times of London a different perspective on this issue, right? That from where she was standing, particularly as a child growing up, right? This didn't look like coming down in the world or sacrificing your virtue. This looked like a better and safer way to make yourself a comfortable living and have some control over your life than, say, like going to work in a match factory where you were probably going to get lockjaw from working with phosphorus or working in a textile mill where your hands might get caught in the machine. You remember when we looked at the article about the women working in the match factory, right? And one of them lost her fingers in the cutting machine because her boss said, never mind your fingers, watch them, watch the frames, watch the machines. So the reason that I point this out, that I want to talk about this, is to demonstrate that these particular narratives, even though they're culturally powerful, come from a particular segment of society. And even within that segment of society, and this is where Goblin Market comes in, these narratives are questioned. In particular, this notion of shunning in Goblin Market, right? That the fallen woman is to be shunned. So, before we go too far into this poem, what did you guys think of this? Like, what did you guys get out of Goblin Market? What's that?
It made me uncomfortable.
Okay, what made you uncomfortable about it, Jamal?
But it felt like the goblins were.
What's that?
They were just creepy and sus and all that.
Okay, yeah, the goblins are creepy.
I feel like the fruit was like a allegory for.
Okay. Yeah, and that is one of the most popular readings of this poem, and there's a lot of evidence for that, right? The fruit does have some kind of sexual resonance at any rate, right? And the goblins behave very differently to the two sisters, right? How do they behave towards Laura when she comes first to buy the fruit?
They were just trying to convince her to buy some fruit.
What's that?
They were trying to convince her to buy the fruit.
Yeah, and she does, right? What does she pay for the fruit with? This is actually also important.
Her whole.
Yeah, yes, a lock of golden hair. All right, you have much gold upon your head. And this is actually kind of important in terms of discourses of femininity that we've been talking about already, right? Let's think back, say, to the mortal immortal, right? What was the only currency, like the only means of exchange that Bertha had access to in that story? What was the only economic power she had?
Herself.
Herself, her beauty. Yes, exactly. And Laura is doing the same thing here, right? She's buying the fruit from the goblins with her beauty. And then what happens after the goblin fruit incident to her?
Well, she feels great, and then she starts to waste away.
Yeah.
Basically dies inside.
Yeah, and a lot of it is described in terms of a physical wasting, right? She's not pretty anymore after a little while. If we look on page 548, right around line 270, day after day, night after night, Laura kept watch in vain, in sullen silence of exceeding pain. She never caught again the goblin cry, "Come buy, come buy." She never spied the goblin men, hawking their fruits along the glen. But when the noon waxed bright, her hair grew thin and gray. She dwindled as the fair full moon doth turn to swift decay and burn her fire away. So the beautiful golden hair that she used as her payment, right, thins and grays after she spends it to buy the fruit from the goblins. And then once she has bought the fruit from the goblins, like even before the dwindling starts, right? How does she behave with them? Or how do they behave towards her? Does she take the fruit away to eat it? Bring it
It's
home?
right in there.
Yeah, basically, yeah, she parties with them, right? If we look on page 544, right, she clipped a precious golden lock, she dropped a tear more rare than pearl, then sucked their fruit globes fair or red, sweeter than honey from the rock, sweeter than man rejoicing wine. Clearer than water flowed that juice, she never tasted such before. How should it cloy with length of use? She sucked and sucked and sucked the more fruits which that unknown orchard bore. She sucked until her lips were sore, then flung the emptied rinds away, but gathered up one kernel stone, and knew not was it night or day as she turned home alone. So yeah, I think as Jamal was saying, right, there is something like kind of like almost orgiastic about Laura's consumption of the fruit, right? There's something that sounds, very much like sexual enjoyment. In her behavior with the goblins, right? And then what does she take away with her, and what does she do with it?
Kernel stone.
Yeah, she takes like one little fruit pit, right? One kernel stone. Why would you do that? What would you hope to gain from that?
To make it yourself.
Yeah, you plant the kernel stone, and then you hope that a tree will grow out of it, right? But when she plants it, does anything grow? Yeah, the kernel stone here is infertile, right? So this activity that she is engaged in with the goblins leads to this kind of sterile outcome, right? It's a dead end. There's no future, right? She can't grow more fruit, right? So yeah, this is all very much caught up in ideas of sex and sexuality, right? Now let's compare what happens when Lizzie goes to meet the goblins.
I didn't like that at all.
This is the part that made you really uncomfortable?
Yeah, I was like, why are they just beating her up?
Easy.
I little man, like, just beat them up. You are taller than them. What is wrong with you?
But yeah, I mean, they do, like, they start by insulting her, right? And then they begin to assault her. And they squeeze the fruits all over her, right? So that, yeah, there is something that sounds almost like, first, like anger of rejection, right? Like, the kinds of things that a guy who's kind of an asshole says if you turn him down for a date, right? So they're like, no, I don't want to go out with you. It's you're stuck up, or you're a bitch, or whatever, right? They say those sorts of things to her. And then they become physically abusive, right? And yeah, and I think probably what makes that scene so uncomfortable is a lot of it does sound a little bit like sexual assault, right? And she undergoes all of this for the sake of someone else, right? So what do we have an example of from our Victorian conduct manuals in Lizzie? Disinterested kindness, yeah. She selflessly goes and braves the taunts of the goblins and the violence of the goblins in order to save her sister, right? So we do have this disinterested kindness idea, and of course, the frickin' markers are good already. I feel like I just put these markers in here. But there's a twist on the usual to this, right? Who is disinterested kindness usually for? Yeah, usually for your husband or sons or brothers or father, right? It's usually directed towards men. Are there any men in this poem?
The goblins?
Yeah, the goblins are male, right? But are there any other obviously masculine figures? And she's not doing this for the sake of the goblins, right? She's doing this for the sake of her sister. So this notion of disinterested kindness here is being turned around, right? And the angel in the house sister is using her virtue not to please a man and to, reclaim a man from the horrors of the world, but to reclaim her fallen sister and reintegrate her safely into a respectable society, right? The idea here being that Laura is not, whatever Laura has done, she's not irredeemable. And that it is the responsibility of other women, that is of her sister here, to take care of each other, not to shame one another. And indeed, right, like it works, right? What do we see at the end of the poem?
Mothers and have kids.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any husband around, right? But they're both wives, and they both have children, right? If we look on page 553, days, weeks, months, years afterwards, when both were wives with children of their own, their mother hearts beset with fears, their lives bound up in tender lives, Laura would call the little ones and tell them of her early prime, those pleasant days long gone of not returning time. Would talk about the haunted glen, the wicked quaint fruit merchant men, their fruits like honey to the throat but poison in the blood, men sell not such in any town. Would tell them how her sister stood in deadly peril to do her good and win the fiery antidote. Then joining hands to little hands would bid them cling together, for there is no friend like a sister in calm or stormy weather, to cheer one on the tedious way, to fetch one if one goes astray, to lift one if one totters down, to strengthen whilst one stands. So the poem is actually making a pretty clear argument, right? And what is that argument that it's making?
Women have to build up each other.
What's that?
Women have to build up each other.
Yeah. That your sister should be your friend and not your enemy, right? That your sister is responsible for you. And that you are responsible for your sister, right? Yeah, I mean, even if we look at the way Lizzie and Laura operate their farm, right? They do this without masculine help. Right? Before Laura goes off and buys the fruits with or at least before Laura starts getting sick from the goblin fruits, right? We see this picture of what they do every day on page 546. Right? Early in the morning, when the first cock crowed his warning, neat like bees, as sweet and busy, Laura rose with Lizzie. Fetched in honey, milked the cows, aired and set to rights the house. Kneaded cakes of whitest wheat, cakes for dainty mouths to eat. Next churned butter, whipped up cream, fed their poultry, sat and sewed. Talked as modest maidens should, Lizzie with an open heart, Laura in an absent dream. One content, one sick in part, one warbling for the mere bright day's delight, one longing for the night. So, do they actually need to buy anything? Yeah, the goblin fruits are completely unnecessary to them, right? They produce everything they need on their farm, right? Through working together. So the goblin's fruits are a luxury, right? Now let's spend a minute talking about the goblins here as well. Again, as the only male figures in the poem, I think that they are important and represent something particularly important here, particularly in terms of Victorian gender discourses and economic discourses. So what did you make of the way the goblins are presented before they assault anybody, right? What do you notice about the goblins at first?
They're very animal-like.
Yeah. What do we usually think of when we think of a goblin? Do we think of anything at all when we think of a goblin? What's that?
I was gonna say Harry Potter, but
Okay, yeah. And what do the goblins in Harry Potter look like?
short and
Yeah, they're kind of short, dwarfy, ugly, right? Long noses, big ears, sparse hair, right? They're these kind of like these like ugly, vaguely horrifying little underground creatures, right? Is there anything obviously terrifying about these goblins in the beginning?
Not really.
They're kind of cute, right?
I don't know about that.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're little walking anthropomorphic animals going up and down, right? We've got one had a cat's face, one whisked a tail, one tramped at a rat's pace, one crawled like a snail, one like a wombat prowled obtuse and furry, one like a ratel, that's a badger, tumbled hurry-scurry. She heard a voice like voice of doves cooing all together. They sounded kind and full of loves in the pleasant weather, right? So yeah, I mean, these goblins, like they look like little stuffed toys, just tramping up and down the glen, trying to get people to buy their fruit. So they're not obviously threatening. And the only reason Laura and Lizzie know they're supposed to avoid them is because they know the story of this other girl, Jeannie, who went and bought their fruits and then withered away and died, right? And this is another example, by the way, of women trying to repair other women's reputations. Lizzie continues to care for Jeannie's grave after her death, right? Never mind that she fell victim to the goblins, right? She was still my friend, and I'm going to care for her remains, right? So the goblins are not obviously threatening. And what else are, how is their activity different from Laura and Lizzie's activity? What do Laura and Lizzie do to make their living?
Work on the farm, work on everything, and the goblins seem like they're just like playing around, like everything's already grown. They're just trying to sell it.
Yeah, Laura and Lizzie are farmers. The goblins are merchants, right? And the fruits they sell are of unknown provenance, right? If we look at their seller's cry on page 542, and by the way, this is written actually in imitation of actual street sellers' pitches from Victorian England, right? Typically, if you were a merchant, like a street merchant in England, you would walk up and down the street of town, singing a little song to get people to come check out your wares, right? Whether you were at a stationery stall in a market or if you were just kind of, walking the streets trying to get people to buy your shit. So morning and evening, maids heard the goblins cry, "Come buy our orchard fruits, come buy, come buy. Apples and quinces, lemons and oranges, plump unpecked cherries, melons and raspberries. Bloom down-cheeked peaches, swart-headed mulberries, wild freeborn cranberries, crab apples, dewberries, pineapples, blackberries, apricots, strawberries, all ripe together in summer weather, morns that pass by, fair eves that fly. Come buy, our grapes fresh from the vine, pomegranates full and fine, dates and sharp bullaces, rare pears and greengages, damsons and bilberries, taste them and try, currants and gooseberries, bright fire-like barberries, figs to fill your mouth, citrons from the south, sweet to tongue and sound to eye. Come buy, come buy." Now, the thing I want to point out about this is that a lot of these are fruits that can't grow in England, right? A lot of these are fruits that would have to be imported. So, what the goblins are selling is by and large non-native produce. Right? Citrons and pomegranates, for example, there's no way you can grow that shit in England. And even as Laura is hearing their cries, she's questioning where this stuff comes from, right? If we look on page 543, right? We must not look at goblin men, we must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots? So the origins of the goblin's fruits are themselves suspicious, right? And the girls know, both of them, to be a little bit distrustful of this fruit. Though Laura acts on impulse and goes and purchases from the goblins, and Lizzie doesn't until she has to do so to save her sister, right?
I'm
So,
suspicious of like what happened to, I believe her name is Jeannie.
one would think, right? They know what happened to Jeannie. Lizzie reminds Laura of that story, right? And I think it's also important to note here, who are the only people the goblins ever appear to? Not just women, right? Think about the specific word user. Morning and evening maids heard the goblins cry.
Young virgin.
Yes. The goblins only appear to virgins. What happens once you've tasted the fruit?
They can't hear their cries anymore with their clothes.
Yeah. Once Laura has eaten the fruit, she tries in vain to find the goblins again, right? But they've scarpered. They're not coming back to her. Once they get what they want from her, they leave. So, I think part of what's going on here is that Laura cannot rely on the male figures that have taken her virtue to rectify that situation or to make good that situation, right? It throws her onto the good graces of her sister, who is the one who really who has to reintegrate her and bring her back into society. But I think it's also important to note here, going back to the means of payment here, right, that both of them use. Why don't they want Lizzie's money? What does Lizzie try to pay them with?
Money.
Yeah, she tries to pay them with money, right? She tries to give them a silver penny. And what do they do? What do they do with her silver penny? What do they say about her silver penny?
They want them to eat with her.
Yeah.
I don't want them to eat with them.
Yeah, they don't care about her money. They don't want her money. They just want her to sit and party with them like her sister did, right? And then when she won't, that's when they get nasty and violent, right? But what's happening here is that Lizzie is attempting to deal with the goblin merchants on equal terms. right? She is entering here that masculine world of business and commerce and trying to pay with actual money, right? Trying to participate in commerce. And the goblins are rejecting her and pushing her out. That's not her role. Laura instead relies on what was typically Victorian women's economic power, right? She buys the fruits of their beauty and then pays for it. So I think there is an argument here for separate masculine and feminine spheres, but that this kind of self-reinforcing, kind of enclosed circle of female work on the farm is healthier and is better than these goblins marching up and down the glen selling fruits, right? That farming is a healthier pursuit than commerce, right? Producing what you need yourself. So, Hannah, you had said something about an interpretation of this. And I don't want to, since we're running short on time, I don't want to discount this or not give you a chance to say anything about it. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you were asking me at the beginning of class?
I just kind of read that Laura was wasting away in relevance to the phases of the moon.
Okay.
Because I think when she started to whisper, her hair whisper, it was talking about the moon, how it was silver and it matched her hair. And by the time the new moon came and the moon disappeared, she'd be dead.
Okay, yeah, and I think there may be, I think there might be, the more I'm thinking about this over the course of it, the more I'm thinking, there might actually be something in this, right? In part because the moon is very much related to our ideas of cyclical time, right? And after that dark of the new moon, what always happens? We get a new crescent moon, it starts waxing again, right? So moon cycles do kind of run from, are cycles of growth and decay, right? The moon grows from nothing to a full moon, then decays back to a new moon, then grows to a full moon again. And this is kind of also an important way that we measure time, right? Where does our word month, for example, come from? Does anybody know? Yeah, exactly. A month is roughly the length of one moon cycle, right? Now, because of various dodgy shit the Romans did to the calendar, this is no longer reflected in the actual length of a moon cycle is about 28 days, right? And I think the way we might be able to relate this more directly to other issues in the poem is that it is also the length of a typical menstrual cycle, right? Is about 28 days. So the moon has often kind of been connected in mythology and in art and in literature to feminine power. Not all cultures historically have represented the moon as feminine, but many have. For example, the Greco-Roman deity associated with the moon, Artemis/Diana, who was also associated with female chastity, is this kind of deity, right? Or this kind of anthropomorphic representation of the moon. So I think it's an interesting idea. And actually, if you wanted to send me where you got the idea, I'd actually like to take a look at that. But Yeah, it's not something I had really thought about before. So, like, if what I'm saying here sounds just kind of like musing out loud and a little bit bullshitty, that's because it is. That's all I am just kind of thinking out loud here. But yeah, I think you have raised a potentially interesting point here. So, is there anything else that you guys want to say about this, or any questions that you have about this poem or about these gender discourses in Victorian Britain?
I like the metaphor, like the imagery they use, like
Uh-huh.
day one, it talks about a lily and a flood, and how like
Okay.
lilies tended to represent like purity, virginity, all that good stuff.
Uh-huh.
And how it's talking about how it's like being basically pushed around by tides. That kind of represents their situation.
Yeah. Yeah, this is when she's being assaulted by the goblins, or she's like a lily in a flood, like a rock of blue-veined stone lashed by tides obstreperously, like a beacon left alone in a hoary roaring sea, sending up a golden fire, like a fruit-crowned orange tree, white with blossoms honey sweet, sore beset by wasp and bee, like a royal virgin town, topped with gilded dome and spire, close beleaguered by a fleet, mad to tug her standard down. So, yeah, like we have all these images of like something under siege, right? Whether it's a town, and I think the town image is actually kind of particularly relevant here, right? It's, what are you trying to do when you lay siege to a town, right? You're trying to breach the walls. Or they're trying to, either tear the standard down or get the fruit from the orange tree or whatever, right? Yeah, I think that is, and it makes those. Yeah, we have all these metaphors here for the goblin's attempted violation of Lizzie. And yeah, they are all these kind of metaphors of attack. Good. What else? Anything else you guys want to say about this?
So from a formal perspective, that's really
What's that?
like a formal perspective, like how it's written.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
It was pretty cool. Like it was easy to get through.
Uh-huh.
And like it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, the themes in the poem are pretty mature, right? But does the verse itself seem almost kind of sing-songy and childlike?
Just like the description.
Uh-huh.
And I guess that's like a good thing they could, like, why they put base it on like goblins. I would
Sure.
Like,
Uh-huh.
'cause the main stuff is like how they describe, like how they compare, like
Uh-huh.
all these fruits, everything's nice, like real nice stuff, but then it's like the goblins playing, like you said, singing, playing,
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, there's this kind of innocent veneer over some actually pretty deep and heavy stuff. What kind of stories do we usually find goblins in? This is actually related to the point that you're making.
Fantasy.
Yeah, fantasies and fairy tales, right? Those are the kind of stories that goblins usually appear in. And this is essentially a fairy tale. It's written, like, children could certainly read this and probably not be damaged, right? And could probably understand, at least on a basic level, what's going on. But like fairy tales, there is also this substratum, barely concealed, of adult content. Right? There is serious intellectual content underneath what we often think of as kind of childish sugarcoating. And the only reason I bring this up is because when this is published in 1862, there's a big vogue in Britain for fairy tales. They're all the, Grimm's fairy tales are translated into English. They're being widely distributed. The 1001 Nights are extremely popular. And it's all being marketed, like none of it was intended for children originally, but it's all being marketed as children's literature. And so in addition to these gender discourses, right, there's also this notion of like that emerging category of the child as a separate kind of being that consumes a different kind of literature than adults do. So we're about out of time, so I'm going to stop it there. But let's give you the reading questions for next time. We'll start getting cleaned up. Don't forget to do your response papers and the vocab quiz over the weekend. And we'll see you on Monday. That's the wrong bag. Here it is. This is the bag.